Hello again! Today we're going to talk about why the hell we stopped playing and what the way that we used to play can actually teach us about unlocking our creativity. The thing that I've been thinking about recently is I think I've been missing the experience of being in flow state. And as much as the productivity space talks about flow state a lot, I think I feel like I haven't been consumed by an activity for a really long time, like ever since I was a kid. I think last time I was consumed, like fully immersed into something, I was a kid for probably playing some kind of game or like really deeply interacting with something. And I found myself craving that experience in my life. And at the same time, it also got me thinking about a lot of the experiences that we had as kids and how they might actually be hints at solutions for creative problems that we might be facing as adults today. And so I wanted to explore this metaphor of you creating is the equivalent of you as a kid on a playground or in any sort of like playful space. And I think this applies to both individual creative work and group creative work. But the metaphor is as follows. I think that the experience that we have with self-censorship or self-judgment in the process of creation is linked to how intimidated we used to be when like someone's parents would be too close to your friend group on the playground and you'd have to go and hide behind like a tree or like a building or something, like hide away somewhere to conspire and plot something with your friends, because if not, there was this kind of like external eye and tension, and I don't really fully know why we used to do that. Like I don't know what the big secret was that we were trying to keep from our parents, but I clearly remember this feeling of like, okay, wait, like parents are too close, like we need to go and talk about our game in another corner, like somewhere else, like it's secret, it's like no one can know or like whatever. And I think part of the imagination that we had as kids is also the fact that like all of a sudden there were these stakes of no, this needs to be protected, this is sacred. And I think as you grow up you kind of start to lose this seriousness, like you start taking yourself too seriously, and by taking yourself too seriously you're actually not as committed and not as loyal to the work. We used to be so loyal to play, and actually on this note I literally brought a photo of my playground. I don't know if I showed it last time, but this is literally like the playground that I used to play on as a kid. And I don't even know if this is like the old version or the like most recent remake of it, because I don't fully remember it being like this. But maybe I'm wrong. But regardless, like this is exactly where what I'm talking about in my life used to happen. So that was just a little something that I found fun. Also, like in the process of thinking about it, I was just like thinking about like, I don't know, like how we used to view the world as kids. And the cool thing from my experience is that I lived in the same place for the first 10 years of my life. And so my childhood is kind of locked in this geography that I haven't really even returned to much in my older years. And so that was just a cool memory lane that I think kind of nourished this discussion a lot. And I think I actually encourage you to do the same, to kind of like really dive into what your experience was with play as a kid, because I think the more precise it is to your experience, the more valuable the conclusions of this kind of like train of thought might be for you. So I think the playground metaphor, and by that I mean literally like the example where you had to sort of like hide away from parents because the parents were kind of like the guardians of the fun somehow. And so you'd have to sneak away and sneak around, and because if not, the parent that's looking out for you kind of feels like a barrier to more fun, or barrier to like, I don't know, maybe you're not supposed to like collect sticks around your playground but you want to for your game and whatever. I don't know, kids do crazy things, good and bad. So I'm not, by the way, I'm not against parental supervision. In fact, I'm probably for it, if anything. But the playground metaphor, first of all, is not about rest but the idea of productive creative play, which is now that I'm saying it out loud, it actually feels kind of obvious. But I do think that a lot of the times we still think of play as kind of like a way to relax, which I think is important. Like I think especially if you work a corporate job like I do right now, I think play, but it can be the play in a productive, creative way, is like a really important way to fight mental fog that you get from a 9 to 5. But essentially, as kids, how we processed our emotions was through playing and through sort of like these make-believe games, and everything that we knew about life, everything we learned about life, and everything we kind of digested mentally somehow was reflected through play. Hence, the sort of evolution, I think, also of games. As you grow up, you kind of change the intensity or the details of the games that you play as you... That's also actually another interesting thing to think about, of like, what games did you play at different important moments of your life. Again, I don't even know to what extent I remember. Like, I remember my memories with enough detail to be able to plot that around, but I do think that if you wanted to trace sort of your emotional experience at any age, the games that you played would probably be a good point to look at. I have a lot of like funny stories about weird make-believe scenarios and reenactions and games that I like played with my friends, that were such a parallel to like what like my family was living at the time, and things like that. And I think that's interesting because that creates a very strong mirroring of how art is often how we process everything as adults or as creative beings, and how through play you're able to relive certain emotions, certain scenarios in a way that allows you to share with your peers. And the same is true for art, obviously, which is where you process your emotions through art, but then it's also a way to kind of experience that with a community and share that with a community and kind of have a collective experience of your individual experiences. So I think that just kind of connects the parallel in my head. Yeah, the whole like plotting and hideaways, for me, that idea comes back to the fact that creativity requires that kind of privacy and that kind of like protective, we need to be the guardians of our creativity and of that like sacred space of like, whether that's your inner critic or your friends who aren't your direct collaborators or the audience or whoever. I think it's important to guard your process until you're ready to actually share it. And if you don't, we'll see, but that kind of hinders the play itself. Like the same reason we didn't actually play in front of our parents, because it was kind of like, you wouldn't be as committed, you wouldn't be as into it, whatever. So in this parallel, your inner critic is that parent supervising, which isn't the parent is not the problem. The parent is there for a very good reason. The parent should be there to make sure that everyone's safe, to be there if anything goes wrong, etc., etc., etc. Hence, your inner critic or your like more conscious, more judgmental, but also rational, let's say, self is useful, but the intimacy of play kind of requires you to also manage that in a way that protects the play. Yeah, because again, when the parents show up, everyone kind of gets shy, self-conscious, and so no one's fully in the moment anymore. And I think that is what it comes down to. So what happens when you let the adults in? I don't know why I wrote it like that, but whether you get shy or violent, like how kids start retaliating and kind of being less pleasant when all of a sudden the adults come. Whatever happens in you as a kid, whether that's, closing off or kind of like seeking attention, whatever happens when you are being perceived, whatever that is just a sign that you're performing, whatever your performance might be. And same thing with, like, I think creating anything, you can very clearly feel it when the process of creativity becomes about the process of seeking validation, seeking love, and it goes back down to the whole You're Not Special video that I made, and kind of how art can also, how what we seek in art can actually be something else and not, can be love. Like how essentially instead of doing art, making art for the sake of art, sometimes I think art becomes this gateway to wanting to be understood, wanting to be loved, wanting to be seen, which actually won't be fulfilled through the creation of art, and where you should actually go and develop your interpersonal relationships instead of, like, you should still make art, but that shouldn't be with the intention of being loved, you know, because I think being loved is such an important thing that shouldn't be attached to your work, and the moment it is, it, you know, makes it harder to actually be honest and be kind of like leveled with your play or your art, your creativity. So I think this is also where obviously the paralysis of like making something good comes in, because if you're doing it from the intention of seeking something else, your intention messes with the process. And so it's the equivalent of editing as you write, or like before you've written. Yeah. And like a thought that's connected to it is just that the thing that you're most afraid of making or communicating or expressing is probably the thing that you should be making, even though socially it might be the scariest thing ever. And yeah, I think it's kind of like a balancing, oh my God, it's a balancing act of, you know, like you obviously want, as a human being, you want to be loved. But as an artist, you should want to create more than you should want to be loved. Because if not, it's the equivalent of like, you know, Netflix and, you know, like the quality, not the quality, but like the authenticity of ideas versus the authenticity of ideas in a smaller, more boutique style production company. Netflix does a lot more market research, does a lot more fulfillment seeking or like enjoyment and engagement seeking research that then influences the work, versus, you know, a company that's much more focused on like the expression of a voice regardless of what reaction it gets. And it's hard because the intertwinement of business and creativity is obviously a complicated sort of like edge to work on, because on the one hand you want to be commercially successful, but on the other hand you want the art to be sincere and genuine. And yes, sometimes the most sincere and the most genuine art is what gets viewed and appreciated, but at the same time that's not always the case. And, you know, very honest things can sometimes make people uncomfortable. And you know, like people also consume media to relax and to kind of like escape life, which is where making art to talk about society is sometimes a complicated and an economically non-viable thing to do, because especially when things are not the best, let's say in a country, more people would much rather hide in like a comforting blanket of stories rather than, you know, be exposed to whatever truthful but hard things. So it is a complicated thing to manage as an artist. But I think in terms of creativity, it's still obviously important to disconnect the two. You can always then go back and edit and improve and, you know, have the inner critic change the original art. But I think the sacred nature of that moment when you're interacting with your medium, your art, when you're expressing and experimenting, even just for your own self-fulfillment. And if we go back to the idea of flow and seeking flow, I think it is what satisfies a creative soul, whether or not the end product is good or bad, commercially speaking. Or even not even commercially. I think a lot of it is also like, even if you don't like it, the process of painting an ugly painting is still worth the pursuit. But obviously, again, and this is my whole point with like the adults not being a problem, your inner critic can always be welcomed back to, you know, look at the work with a critical eye and actually consider what you're communicating with it, how it could get interpreted, and, you know, whether or not you actually want to put it out there in that form. But I think as a creative, the solution is almost always to first go and hide behind that tree. Protect your little vulnerability moment so that you can be as honest as you can with yourself, so that then you can have material for things you do and you don't want to communicate to the world. And here also, the bare minimum or a bad piece of work is actually worth the pursuit as well, for the experience of creation, but also because 10 minutes of bad writing is better than an hour of strategizing or thinking about what, you know, beautiful writing you're gonna create. And I think this is the equivalent of when you go down to the playground as a kid, you don't necessarily know, you know, who's going to be there, what the vibe is going to be, how much of like a good time you're going to have playing. Like, you know, like I'm sure there were some play dates that were much more impactful than others, or like a game that felt much more like a round of a game that felt much more thrilling than another. I'm sure that there were these, you know, differences, but you liked play for the sake of playing. And so you showed up knowing that maybe it's not going to be as fun, but if you don't show up, you're definitely not going to have fun, which again are obvious things, but I think in terms of creativity, I have forgotten these things. And it has become so much more about the final outcome and the quality of the work, which somehow has discredited the process and the value of just living the thing. Like, on a rational level, if you ask me, do I want to spend 10 minutes or even longer or whatever writing if I know that the outcome is not going to be usable, I'm probably going to tell you no. But that makes me so sad from the perspective that there's a part of me, that like flow state addicted part of me, that's no longer actively here, that this entire thing is about bringing back. And I think finding that value internally and finding that value from the process itself means that the work, in the meaning of the playing, becomes the point. And the work in output, I don't have proof for this, but the work in output I'm sure is connected, because if you enjoy writing, you will inevitably write more than a person who doesn't, or than the version of you that doesn't enjoy writing. And that just through the means of both practice and chance exposes you to the potential of writing something you'll actually like, and then by association writing something that other people might resonate with. The other thing is that even bad writing, if done genuinely, can touch people and can change people's lives in ways that I think should also not be undermined. I also don't know why a lot of these metaphors in this in these notes ended up being about writing, even though this can apply to anything, and this maybe applies to other things better than it does to writing. But regardless, this is kind of the thoughts that I was trying to like put together. My conclusion being that, like, sure, maybe the internalized adults aren't going to leave, but we still have control over how we look for solutions to that. So sure, maybe like your going to have that criticism, that judgment that comes from also, consuming and creating work. Like the how opinionated you are about the medium that you work in is also going to improve and sharpen as you work more. But I think we need to be equally creative in the solutions that we look for when hiding from our internalized adults, and be as desperate to find that hideaway as we were when we were kids, so that then we can actually have fun and make art, which is what inevitably we all want to do. And as a reminder that that's what we want to do more than we want to make good art. So this is kind of what I had in mind, what I've been sitting with. It feels incomplete because I think a lot of this conversation actually ends up being about going and doing it. And in today's society, I think that also means being present and putting your phone away and kind of pausing and disconnecting from the fast pace of life, so that you can actually sit and be loyal to something that doesn't exist, which is what play used to be and which is what art is until you make it. The other thing that I've kind of been trying to develop is I started gathering little references to look into, which sometimes some of them I've looked into before, and others are notes that I took for myself to look into later. But so I always share a link in the description for the notes of these little videos, and underneath you will find the references, and we can actually go over them a tiny bit. The books, obviously, I haven't read yet, but I wanted to read. I've also been reading another book, actually, but it's not necessarily connected to the metaphor of play for work, for creative work. It's more connected to the use of play, the necessity of fun through play for like a happy, healthy life. But I can find that also. And then essays, looked into some of those. Brian Eno is an interesting one because he has been working for so long, and play is like a structural setup that he works in. Like it's his structure to his day. And I find that really inspiring because I think a lot of the times when you enter a creative profession and you're young, you have this drive to like have fun, and then I think over time it's so easy to fall into the habitual sort of routine defaults. And it's so inspiring, I think, to see how you can have that be a consistent part and like a structural design of your working system. So that kind of, I think, reassures a part of me. And he's been able to make so much music and such good quality like soundscapes that it's also at the same time like proof that it works. This one is an interesting example because I've actually like been reading different books where his name, Winnicott, has been coming up. And he's, I think, like a psychologist. I would say a child psychologist, but I'm guessing it's not just applicable to children. But I know that a lot of like identity and like child development, which then leads to like identity development, has been written about by him. So that's interesting. This one is an interesting one that I found when researching this, but I haven't fully looked into. And then A24 is my forever reference. How they kind of like guided themselves with strangeness as like a priority of like, if it's not obvious, let's give it a second chance kind of thing. I mean, I know that's not technically what their strategy is, word per word, but just that idea that you need to be deliberately willing to go outside the box to find something gold. Yeah, but I do want to know, and this is interesting because they're indie-ish. We don't know as much about their process as like bigger companies or companies that like communicated around it a lot more. Like Pixar communicated so much about their process. So I'd be interesting to know more about how they work internally and how they cultivate that kind of culture. Because I think this conversation, the thing it goes back to is consistency. Like if you're able to enjoy the process, what it unlocks for you is actually just the consistency of happy life, a life you enjoy, and creative output. So yeah, I don't know where any of this leads this week, but it's nice to be back. I haven't updated this in a while, but I felt like there were things here that I haven't explored. And I'm excited to revisit maybe some of them, but also keep moving. Yeah, hopefully this, unlocks something, which I'm not sure yet if it does for me. So I'll check back in with you in a week. We'll see. Hopefully I'm having more playground time by then. I don't know if that's a weird way to use that metaphor, but oh well. Thanks for sticking around. And yeah, you can find the links to all these things in the description. Time stamps, like the chapter marks, also, normally. Let me know if all of that works, and as always, I'll see you next week. Bye bye.